Why don't we begin with a little prayer from today's gospel? Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. The handout that I gave you has a series of items on it that I'd like to use by way of structure for the conversation, and then after the input, then go ahead and we can share it toward the end of the hour, and then certainly by the third time to do that in greater depth. Most of what I'm going to give you is research that I did concerning Volume 3 of the History of the Archdiocese. And I found that to be really fascinating for me personally because this was the life that I lived. I was born in North St. Louis. In fact, lived just 1 block south of Beaumont High School. I remember as a little kid up on the second floor of a two-family flat watching the Beaumont High School bands practicing on the football field there. And then my father was transferred to Chicago, where we lived for 1 year in Elmhurst, a suburb outside of Chicago. And I think that's when he discovered his love for Bonanza land. And so when he moved back to St. Louis, he was the first of the family to move into the county. And we just kept on moving further and further west. And I wanted to understand the dynamic. Most of my parents are gone now, but I wanted to understand the dynamic of what was going on there. Not just him, but millions of people. And so that's why, and next week I'll go ahead and give you a bibliography of all the books that I used in order to put this together. But basically, the first thing I'd like to look at is why city folks headed to the county. Sociologists tell us that there are two factors involved in this, are what are called pull factors and push factors. And the pull factors were these. First of all, by the late 19th century, starting in Chicago and then spreading throughout the whole United States, was the creation of homes that were called balloon homes. And to give you an example of what we mean there, many of us live in these balloon homes. Basically, they're frame homes, and it's much easier and cheaper to build. And they're just as sturdy as the old homes that came about before. And so you have that introduction. Let's see if I can go back. No? Yeah. Secondly, farmland became cheap. What happens is if you look at the economics of the United States, in World War I, the United States became the breadbasket of the world. We produced food to basically feed almost everybody in the world. And when the war came to an end, World War I came to an end, we were still producing massive amounts of food. And we had the machinery in order to do this. And so what happened was that now other countries started producing food, and therefore food prices went down. And when the food prices went down, the farmland went down too. And again, very personal experience of this, when my family moved out to Creve Coeur, our next door neighbor was the Douster family. Frank Douster had inherited the farm from his dad when he was a teenager. His farm, if you can imagine this, ran from Ballast Road to Lindbergh. From Ladue Road, just south of Olive. Massive amounts. The guy died a multimillionaire, ended up selling all that land off little by little, and bought land down in the Missouri Bottoms, Gumbo area. His grandchildren still have farms down there, the Douster Farms. So he sold off that land little by little, and it was cheap. So now you've got cheap houses and you've got cheap land, and here's an example of that. This one here on the left is out in Wildwood, and the one on the right is down in South County. And I didn't notice this when I took those pictures, but if you look at the one on the left, you see that McMansion right over in the edge? In South County, the same way, another McMansion right over there. Third, highways were built, and we'll talk about that too, that's important. Highway 40 takes out a whole wedge, goes out straight west. Highway 55 goes south. Highway 70 goes north and west. And that's going to put all of those houses, those balloon houses that are on cheap land, now you're going to be able to live out there and work in the city because of the highways. But the highways also have another deleterious effect on St. Louis. We'll talk about that later. Thirdly, you have then shopping centers and strip malls so that you don't have to go downtown anymore. Highways, and we're experiencing this thing right now, the whole question about what's going to happen to Jeffrey Plaza, which is a strip mall. And then finally, the last of the pull factors is federal housing encouraging lending. And this particularly comes in three areas. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, which we'll take a good look at, the Federal Housing Authority, which we'll take a good look at, and then also the Veterans Administration loans. So money is available in order to move out. So these are all pull factors. They're taking people in the city and encouraging them to come into the county in order to buy these new homes. Then also you've got push factors. There are things that are happening in the city that are going to push people out away from the city, where people are going to want to move out of the city. Like I say, my parents were the first ones in both families to leave the city to move to the county. But by the time I was an adult and I left home, most of our family was now living in the county rather than the city. So what's happening here? First of all, you've got highways cutting through the old neighborhoods. It was under the guise of urban renewal, which we'll take another look at a little bit later on. Secondly, public education began to decline. We're going to look at one school in particular, Soldan High School, and see what happened to that. And then also, housing stock was old and deteriorating, and they could not get loans. It's not until much later that you have this regentrification taking place where people could get loans to move into people like areas like Lafayette Square and the area around St. Margaret of Scotland, Tower Grove area. But before that, you couldn't get those loans. And then finally, also you have crime was on the increase in the city. Now, crime in the 1950s and 1960s was nothing in comparison to the crime in St. Louis in the 1920s. I mean, if you looked at what was going on in the 1920s with the gangs and the prohibition and all of that, St. Louis was a very, very dangerous city, and it was very dangerous for policemen. In the 1950s and 60s, that was less so, but the perspective was there, which we'll take a look at. So, housing, balloon houses, cheap land, highway system, and you notice the way this highway system is built, it heads out away from the city. And then you have these rings around the city. And now you end up with this particular, it's kind of a comical map. If you're a St. Louisan and you take a look at this, you know exactly what we're talking about. Oh, you can't hardly see that, can you? Sorry. I don't know if I get this any clearer or not. That's the best I can do. Well, I'll just read off some of these for you. So if you look at where we are, you can see Forest Park over here. I don't have a pointer. See Forest Park over here and the Inner Belt, and then around there, between those cars parked in the inner belt. It says BMW drivers, Asian and Jewish nerds, Jews, Asians, middle class black, what else? Over west of the inner belt, you've got doctors, millionaires, white guilt, Beverly Hills, rich private school kids. Further out, you've got old money. Out in Creve you've got Jews, elitism, rich old women shopping, has more money than you, those kind of things. And that's kind of the stereotype that you have of St. Louis. I'm sorry? Yeah, I got it off the internet, and I don't remember where. Yeah, but I'm sure you can find it.
Yeah, no, it's just growing up in St. Louis, but not originally being from here. I will say it's one of the most segregated cities in America I've ever come to, and like having parents that chose to grow up, have myself and my brother grow up in Wildwood, then I went from Catholic school to public, and constantly being asked, even to this day, I'm 30 years old, being asked, what high school did you go to?
Yeah.
It's one of the most racist questions I've ever heard. Because they want to know how much money my parents made. I'm like, I don't live with them, I don't care. Like, I was born in Nevada. So, being a white woman in St. Louis right now, knowing all of this, even at age 13, and being judged where I came from at 13, not from here, and still to this day feeling like I'm not good enough to be a St. Louisan, this is beautiful to see in a Catholic church. So, thank you. That's all I have to say about that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Validating everything I've ever known.
I hope so.
Yeah.
So now the next question really is, and that next one on this chart is, why white families could move to the county, but black families could not. And it basically comes down to two things in particular. These are Depression era New Deal programs. And how this happens is this. First of all, you have the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It is created in 1933. And basically the idea was this, that if you were going to buy a home in the 1920s, first of all, you had to put 50% down. Not many people can do that. So your original deposit was 50% of the price of the home. And then after that, you had to have the thing paid off in 10 years. So that's a very difficult sort of a thing to happen. And what happens is that in the Depression, 1929 and 1932, you had an awful lot of people who were not able, they were losing their jobs and they couldn't pay that amount. And so what happened was they were going to be foreclosed on. And instead, the Roosevelt administration created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in which the government, the federal government came in and they bought up all those mortgages before the foreclosures. And then they turned around and they made them into 25 and 30-year mortgages rather than the 10-year. And that became possible for people to stay in their homes and slowly begin to pay them off. The other thing too that they introduced was so the other thing they introduced also was the idea that with every payment that you made on the mortgage, it included a certain amount on the principal. Before that, it was just the interest, not on principal. So this is a real advantage that's taking place financially for people to do. This is extremely important because there are two things in modern economy that have a multiplication effect. It's absolutely incredible. One is the automobile, and the other one I want to talk about is the housing. A house is just not a house. It's also, you've got to build that house. You have to have masons and you have to have carpenters. So they're going to have to be employed. But beyond that, you also have the material. So you have to have lumber mills, and you've got to have lumber jacks, and And then same thing with the concrete. It's multifaceted. And then once you have the house built, then the next thing you have to do is you have to put stuff in it. And so you're going to have furniture, you have to have appliances, and that creates demand. So that was the brilliance behind the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And then the next year is the Federal Housing Administration. That's in 1934. And basically this is for new homeowners. And the federal government would guarantee that loan up to 80%. So that would be possible to have then. And these loans were favored for new housing. It's new housing. Here's a quote from the FHA. It says, older properties have a tendency to accelerate the rate of transition to low-class occupancy. Now go back over to the other one, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and you have the same thing in which the federal government doesn't want to invest in what might be a bad investment, at least from their point of view. And so what they're going to do is they're going to set up a multicolored chart showing desirable and less desirable neighborhoods. And one of the criterion for the housing stock, one of those is what they called racial homogeneity. Depends on whether it's white or not. Now, keep in mind that what's happening is this is very political. This is the New Deal, and the only way this legislation could get through is if Franklin Delano Roosevelt had Southern Democrats who would be able to vote for this. And so everything baked into what's being done in the New Deal has a racist element to it. Okay? And we forget that. We forget that part of history, but it's very much there. Here's an example. If you want a book on this, and I'll give you several books to consider. A book that's going to describe this in great detail, it's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And he describes this better than anybody of what happened and why we are where we are. This is a map of St. Louis done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And you can see the various colors of the various neighborhoods. And if you wanted to get a loan, you had to be in a certain colored neighborhood, and then they would give you a loan. If you were in the wrong colored neighborhood, you would not get a loan. And interestingly enough, if you look at this map, it is very, very close to the line to race. And so you end up with the situation that we look at today. They call it, we talk about the Delmar Divide. I think it's more, they use that because it clings. It's actually closer to an olive divide, but you can't say that. But olive divide, Delmar Divide. I talked to one of our parishioners last Christmas, and we were talking about her moving into University City. She did that about 50 years, longer than that, about 60, 70 years ago. And the realtor that she dealt with would not show her a house south of Olive Boulevard. It was only north of Olive Boulevard. And it was specifically based on race and redlining, which we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Msgr,
Yes,
are you ready to discuss the redlining of your city back in the 50s and 60s?
we will, yeah. This is a quote here from a very powerful book. I'll talk about that a little bit later on too, but it says this: the whole world's seen the maps. One starts out hot red or orange for the African American population in the city's core and cools to the shades of Caucasian blue in the suburbs. Another uses stark black and white to show the Delmar Divide, named by the BBC. It comes from Britain. They're the ones that came up with this. 95% of black north of Delmar Boulevard, almost 2/3 white south of it. Others trace that racial divide in St. Louis County, coloring in 90 municipalities like it's election night. There's some people that try to work against the system, and one of those is this man on the right, Charles Vatterott. Now, Charles Vatterott is famous in St. Louis for building subdivisions, especially for the working class people. St. Anne's, Overland, a lot of those homes. They're very modest balloon homes set on small lots, but they were affordable. And he did a lot of that. He put in strip malls. He also has his family has a what they call Vatterott College, which is actually a trade school, very much so. But he saw, even in the 1950s, he saw a need for lower middle class housing for black families also. Now, we were still leading with a segregated situation, and so what he did was he built what he called the Martin de Porres community, and that was in Breckenridge Hills, North County. He builds these houses fully expecting black families to move out of the city into Breckenridge Hills and to begin the process of home ownership also. What he found was that the FHA and the VA refused to lend to black families. And so as a result of that, he was not able to sell his homes to the black families and instead ended up renting them to them. This is the deleterious effect, and that is this. This denied these families to begin building equity in home ownership. That's the way of prosperity in America today. You know, you own your own home, you've got that investment, and typically, with the exception of certain downturns we had, like for instance 10 years ago, but typically that house is always worth more than what you originally bought it for. That's wealth in America, and that's been denied in the 1950s to black families. Now, added to this, you also have the 3 highway systems that slice through the neighborhoods. Clarence Lang, who is one of the authors I really want to recommend to you, said this. He said, urban renewal actually is Negro removal. Give you some examples. Highway 40 or 64 cut directly through Mill Creek. Now, Mill Creek was a poor and dilapidated area. It goes back to the early days of the city, certainly pre-Civil War. Many of those buildings were also pre-Civil War. They were crumbling, and they were inhabited by poor whites and poor blacks. And the Highway 64, which we take every day going downtown, that cut right through Mill Creek. And when it did, it displaced, this is 1959, it displaced 1,700 mostly African-American families, as well as another 610 individuals. There was no provision for these people where to move. So what happens is that as Clarence Lang studies this, he's a historian, and he's studying this, he's finding the families, and where do these families go? And typically what happened was most of these families moved out of Mill Creek. They got almost nothing for their property, and they moved to houses that were being made available on North Grand, east of North Grand and west of North Grand, because people who were living in those houses, they were moving out to the county, and they were white, and they were getting all the advantages of the pull factors that were available to them, and now these big old homes were available, and so poor black families moved into those homes, and in many cases, because they couldn't buy the homes, they could rent them, and the rent was high enough that no family could pay for the rent. And so what they did instead was they doubled up and then have 2 and 3 families in these 2-story and 3-story homes on North Grand, east or west of North Grand. Yes.
Did your idol also get involved at that point?
Yes, because that's the next thing. Pruitt-Igoe had been built just prior to this, okay? Pruitt was for white families and Igoe was for black families. But too few whites moved in, and ultimately it became entirely African-American, Pruitt-Igoe. There's some real problems with Pruitt-Igoe, though, and one of which is they were not well built, for one thing. There are a lot of structural problems with them. Secondly, there was no transportation there. They didn't have, they were not on a bus line. So, terrible. There were no stores in that neighborhood. You know, there was no light industry to where people could work. So basically, people were being sent there, and those who moved there were isolated. You know.
Monsignor?
Yes.
Can I say one other thing about Archdiocese?
Yes.
The way they built it, high rise, elevators, no restrooms. I grew up in Carr Square Village, which was it's still around, low rise. But I had friends who lived in Archdiocese. And when you would go in to the buildings and you had to go in the elevator, it was very tough. Because since there were no bathrooms on big floors, children would, I guess adults would use bathrooms in those elevators. But it really was not a good, it wasn't well thought out. It really was not.
Talking about the elevators, they didn't stop on every floor. They stopped on every other floor.
And you got children who play outside. You gotta go, it just was not well thought out.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
it really wasn't. There's a wonderful documentary that came out a couple years ago, produced here in St. Louis. I have a copy of it, a DVD, and it talks about Archdiocese. And in the first part of it, the people who moved there were so excited about it. You know, they were very happy about this. And but then those sorts of problems began taking place. Crime was taking place. Everything began deteriorating. There's a story about one lady who had taken a wall of her living room, and she painted it all black. And the authorities found out about it, and they sent somebody in, and they said, you know, you violated your agreement here. You painted this thing black. Why did you do that? And she said, it's a chalkboard. I'm teaching my kids multiplication and arithmetic on the chalkboard. And the authorities said, fine, great, good for you. And that was the end of that. But it was a very difficult kind of a situation that deteriorated over the years. We're going to see a little bit later on how Monsignor Shockley was right there at that spot and what he did in order to try to ameliorate some of those problems. So more results of Highway 40. Available housing, public housing, Carr Square, mentioned there, Darst Webby, George Vaughan. These are all built in the time of the Depression. They now went from being working poor to basically being ghettos. A lot of unemployed being in those housing, public housing areas. At the same time, you also had black professionals. We had doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers, nurses, etc. They're also moving north of Grand, but between Grand and Kings Highway. And these are big, old, beautiful homes that have been abandoned by white families that are moving out to the county. And they're coming in. They can afford to buy these homes. They can afford to keep these homes up. And so you have areas like, for instance, Fountain Square, or areas that I'm more familiar with myself, East Northland and East Highland. When I was the pastor at Blessed Sacrament, several of my parishioners who were themselves professionals were living in those areas, with big, beautiful homes. In fact, at one time, Northland Avenue was east between Kings Highway and going east toward Grand was one of the spots that you always went to at Christmas time. You know, I think there's a place in South St. Louis where you drive around and everyone's got their houses all decorated. East Northland, it was the same way. Now you also have Highway Interstate 70, and that slices north and west. And so here you have blighted neighborhoods that are along the riverfront. Take Highway 70 going north, Highway 55, 70 going north, and you're going to see almost nothing east of that. There had been housing there, and west of that, very depressed housing. It slices right through old North St. Louis, through the Hyde Park neighborhood, and here you have a situation again where white families are being displaced. These are These are buildings, these are houses that were built in the late 19th or mid 19th century. They're now being bought out in order to put that highway in, and then they're getting their loans in order, and they tend to move to North County. At the same time, you also have other families that the houses are not taken down, but you have whites that then either sell or rent to black families who are desperate for housing because they had been kicked out of the Mill Creek area. Interstate 55, same way, it cuts south, and there it goes right through the Soulard area, and again, white families tend to move to South County. As a result of that, black families that are desperate for housing take whatever's left behind. Now, there's a history major at Lindenwood who did a study, and it was published in one of Lindenwood's historical journal called Confluence, and her name is Sarah Siegel, and what she did was she studied the Central West End, but not the entire Central West End. She actually studied the northern part of that, what we would call Kingsway East, that's what's called today. So this is area, she describes it herself, running from Forest Park, the northern part of Forest Park, north up the Natural Bridge, from Kings Highway to the city limits. Her name is Sarah Siegel. The article is called Gateway Liberalism, Catholic and Jewish Responses to Racial Transitioning Neighborhoods and Schools in St. Louis's West End, 1945 to 1960. And she looks at what, in that neighborhood, what are the social assets that are available? And what's up there is this: Soldan High School, Temple Israel, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, St. Rose of Lima Parish, and St. Mark's Parish. So those are 5 areas there. There are 5 institutions that are supportive of that part of North St. Louis. Yeah.
Got a question on that.
Yeah.
Did the Central West End have a different meaning back then? Because right now the Central West End is east of Kings Highway, correct? But that's
Yes.
suggesting Kings Highway to the west.
Yeah.
So can you explain what she meant by Central West End?
Yeah, so yeah, she's using that term. That's why I wanted to show you exactly where she's talking about, because it's not what we would call Central West End today.
Okay.
Yeah, we would tend to think, when I think of Central West End, I'm thinking about Straub's on Kings Highway. I'm thinking about the cathedral, Euclid, yeah, that kind of thing. She's further north of that.
And further west.
And further west, right, yeah. She's doing a sociological and historical study of a group of people, especially Jews and Catholics. This neighborhood is very Jewish, very Catholic, and what happens to disrupt this neighborhood?
And that's still part of the Kings Highway brand section of the more affluent, the more educated that you mentioned on a couple slides prior.
Right.
Like the black families, because that's where the hospitals are. So they were closer to their jobs and their churches.
Right.
So that makes sense.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I forget which decade you were referring to with that slide.
I'm sorry?
I forget which decade you were referring to with that slide, but it's still on the same page as this study.
Yeah, she's talking about 1945 to 1960.
Okay, and that was the 20s that you were referring to, maybe?
It was what?
The couple slides previously, where was the black families that were educated and still had
Right,
jobs?
yeah. Yeah, so that particular area is also right next to, it's contiguous to another black neighborhood called the Ville.
Right.
And we'll talk about the Ville a little bit later too. And it's been around for a long time, and again, it's mostly a lot of professionals that are living in that area too. So 3 things are happening around this time. First of all, in 1947, Cardinal Ritter integrates Catholic schools. This is several years before Brown versus the Board of Education. Even before Brown, in 1948, you've got Shelley versus Kramer, which is a very important ruling that a lot of people overlook. It came out of right here in St. Louis. What happened was there was a family that wanted to buy a house on Labadee. The house is still there. And, but the neighborhood had a covenant, which is to say that you could only sell to other white families. And so what happened was that, that the Shelley family got another family, a white family, to buy the house for them, and then they moved in, buying the house from that white family. It violated the covenant. And the neighbors across the street, the Kramers, objected to this and took them to court. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that covenants were unconstitutional. And so it's going to cause, at least theoretically, it's going to cause the integration of housing. Now, obviously, that doesn't take place, and we'll see a little bit later on why. But that's the idea behind this. So these three things happening, and then Brown versus the Board of Education, Kansas, causes schools to be desegregated. So Sarah Siegel goes to specifically goes to Soldan High School and the neighborhood around that, and then along with that, the Ville neighborhood, in order to see how this develops, where you have the integration and then how it disintegrates so rapidly. So again, in the Ville neighborhood, you had Homer G. Phillips Hospital, Annie Malone Home, Charles Sumner High School, all black professionals and black merchants. Now, in 1955, responding to Brown versus the Board of Education, Soldan High School, which was all white, mostly Jewish, decided to be proactive and to integrate the school on February 1st of 1955, and they invited black students from two neighboring high schools, all black schools, to come to join them at Soldan. And 375 black students went. They came either from Sumner High School or from Vashon High School. And so the enrollment then of Soldan increased up to 1,300. 14% of Sumner High School and Vashon High School left their high schools in order to join in this, this integrated experiment that takes place. Okay, that's 1955. By 1959, 3.5 years later, Siegel discovers that while that area of the Central West End that she's talking about is still 50% white, Soldan High School is now 99% black. 3.5 years. So the question is, as she asked the question, is where did all the white kids go? And as she found out, what happened was that there came a point, a tipping point, in which white families pulled their kids out of the Soldan High School, and they did one of two things. Either they tried to get them into private schools, and they did not have any luck as far as the Catholic schools. And the reason for that is that Cardinal Carberry and then later Archbishop May refused to allow transfers from public schools to Catholic schools. The only way you could get into a Catholic school is that if you had been in a Catholic school or if your family moved to St. Louis. But if you had been in a public school the year before, you were not allowed to be enrolled into Catholic schools. Especially Archbishop May made it very clear that he did not want to use the Catholic schools as a haven for whites trying to flee from integrated schools. So that's one thing. The other thing is she also found that families in that neighborhood who had relatives in the county would then enroll their children in that address, so that they might still be living in that upper Central West End, But in fact, they're going to be enrolling in schools in the county, and that's taking place also. I'd like to read you a little section from Elaine Witt. If you've been around St. Louis a long enough time, you know Elaine Witt. She was a writer for the Post-Dispatch and a very popular writer. But she says the following, her experience. And see if this doesn't ring true. She said, I was born in the city. What I remember best about it was the sounds of my neighborhood, the siren song of the police cars, the sharp, quick, hot tamales cry of the tamale man, and the high-pitched, church-like chant of the newspaper sellers as their carts rumbled down the street on Saturday night. Post, paper. Then one day, the sirens got a little louder. There was a police shooting on my street, and a stray bullet went through my parents' window. The neighborhood was going bad. There was tension, uneasiness, and frightening encounters, and no one knew how to fight it. All you could do was to take your kids and move to a safer place. And so my parents, like so many others in the 1950s, moved to the suburbs and to silence. I did not hear the police sirens anymore, not in a nice neighborhood. I didn't hear the chant of the paper sellers either. We bought our papers after church on Sunday. We got our tamales in the cold quiet of the frozen food case in the supermarket. Everything was quiet, even the drone of the lawnmowers on Saturday morning. And replicate that over and over again, hundreds of thousands of times. Who are the big losers in all of this? Interestingly enough, Siegel finds out that it's black teachers. If you look at the segregated states in the 1950s, 1 out of every 5 teachers was black African American. If you look at the integrated states, 1 out of every 76 was black. Now there are reasons for that. One is that the segregated states tend to be in the South, and at the time, in the 1950s, there were more blacks living in the South than in the North, in the integrated states. But the end result is going to be, if you follow the teachers, when Vashon and Sumner lost those 300 and something students, those were teachers that were going to be unemployed. They did not go over to Soldan. So many of them were very upset about this. And in fact, the 2 aldermen in the Ville area, I'm sorry, not aldermen, state representatives in the Ville area, in the State House in Missouri, actually introduced a petition, a law which unfortunately didn't go through. But the idea was to make segregation and integration an option for every school district rather than enforced throughout. And this was in order to protect black jobs. Also, black students were the losers in all of this. Some of the NAACP lawyers noted that black students in a majority white school suffered from isolation, loss of cultural identity, pressure to take on white attitudes. Their grades declined, dropout rates grew. And also, the city of St. Louis was going to be the big loser in this too, because the metropolitan area was going to resegregate, creating what we call a white donut around the urban area. And if you look at the racial map of St. Louis city and county in the 1950s and early 1960s, that's exactly what was happening. So that you had a black core in North St. Louis, white South St. Louis, and then South County, West County, North County was all white also. And we're going to see how that breaks down But that's the way it was, and that resegregates, takes place. Here's some results. In 1960, Wellston had 8% black population. 10 years later, it's 69% black population. Berkeley went from 9% to 49%, Pine Lawn 21% to 81%, Moline Acres 32% to 66%. The city of St. Louis was 29% African American in 1960, 41% in 1970. Today it's 49%. University City, that came as a real shock to me. In 1960, there was not a single black family living in University City. In 1980, it was 43%. Today, it's 78%. I'm sorry? 38%. What did I say? 78. Oh, sorry, 38%. Yeah, thank you.
Father,
Yes.
our children went to the U City schools, and when we moved there in '74, our kids were in kindergarten, the schools were pretty integrated, and they continued to do that until then, like in our area, which is right by City Hall, where the expensive houses, what started happening, instead of families moving in who were sending their children to public schools, they sent them to private schools. By the time we moved out 2 years ago, I could stand on my porch and there were 14 children in houses within sight that all went to private schools. My kids used to be able to go out and play with, 10, 15 kids when they were growing up and going through the schools. But it changed that much in that time that we were there.
Yeah.
And so people are coming in, they're coming in with families, but they're not sending them to public schools at all.
Yeah. And certainly, back in the 1960s and early 1970s, University City high schools, public high schools, had a national reputation of being the finest. I mean, I remember feeling pretty bad about my high school, University High School, because we didn't have a lot. And I was in the orchestra, I played trombone. And we found out that University City High School was, their orchestra was doing the 1812 Overture. And we said, well, could we do that too? And our conductor, our teacher, music teacher said, no, we can't do that because we can't afford the canon. University City High School band had a canon.
Yeah. The schools were great. The band was wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Everything was so great until about maybe 20 years ago.
When was it that the school that's currently vacant right on Kingsland went down?
Gilmore Harbor?
Yes. Our
granddaughter went there for a year, so I'm going to say about 15 years ago.
And it's been vacant ever since.
Yes.
That is a home, honestly. It's a beautiful building.
Yeah. A lot of these buildings, school buildings in University City were award-winning. The high school itself is
So
a
that alone is just proof that the majority of the kids that still live in New City are going to the different Catholic schools, correct?
Not just kids.
Not just Catholic.
Well, like the private schools, because otherwise there's obviously kids everywhere. It's a matter of the fact that they're not attending, so there's not enough attendance for the public schools for them to open that back up.
Right.
The income of the families coming in
Right.
has raised.
Right.
In support of your comment about U City being known nationally,
yeah.
in 1964, we were living and I was working in the oil industry in Houston, Texas. Something came up and I was up in the front offices. One of the secretaries says, "Oh, you're from St. Louis, but you know you've got one of the top 10 school systems in all of America?" And I said, "No." I was thinking he was going to say my school system. It was University City.
Yeah.
Where we live.
Yeah.
All I said was I'm from St. Louis, and they knew U City was in top 10.
Yeah.
I mean, even today, Clayton has probably been the state's top school for over a decade.
Yeah.
Because I was Lafayette, or graduated in Lafayette, but I didn't start there. And we're usually in the top 10, but Clayton has miraculously stayed the top of the state. But even then, to be able to, even myself, like to be able to afford a house in Clayton as a 30-year-old white woman right now is impossible. Because I graduated high school in '08, and
So one of those that, and I refer to quite a bit, is Clarence Lang. His book is entitled Grassroots at the Gateway, Class Politics and Black Freedom Struggle in St. Louis, 1936 to 1970. And he says the following about this. So there's an awareness, a self-awareness that's coming about. It's actually developed here in St. Louis in the 1920s, 30s, especially the 30s and the 40s, and we'll take a look at some of that. But he said this, he said, a self-conscious African-American working-class public sphere had emerged, led and peopled by unskilled industrial laborers and skilled craftsmen, educators and social workers, dining car cooks and sleeping car porters and maids, housewives and the homeless, educators, attorneys and unemployed, middle class and young, the secular and the religious, millenarian black nationalists, communists, socialists, and independent radicals. In other cases, as in the nutpickers abiding religious faith in defiance of communist orthodoxy, they followed their own prerogatives. So this is a broad-based movement that's happening of self-consciousness that's beginning to well up, not just here in St. Louis, but throughout the United States. And that's the first step that has to happen. There was a movie came out last year, I didn't see it though. It's called The Green Book. You haven't heard of it? Or maybe you saw it. I knew about The Green Book when I was working on Volume 3, and it's named after the man. It's not just it's a green book, but it's named after Mr. Green, and who came up with the idea. And what he did was he went all throughout the United States and was looking for every city for areas that would serve African Americans that they could travel. And it's interesting to see from year to year how the Green Book changes, and the number of restaurants that are available in St. Louis, the number of filling stations, things of that nature, hotels, it just increases year by year. But this was a real strong self-awareness was developing. So here are some actions that St. Louis, you get the complacency beginning to break down. And for one thing, you had A. Philip Randolph, during the Second World War, introduced what he called the double victory rallies. And a double victory rally is that you've got black soldiers who are fighting against Imperial Japan, against Nazi Germany, and so they're fighting against racism. And the double victory is, okay, you've got the Axis, but you also have America. And so if you're going to be fighting against the Nazis, we have to be fighting against racism in America also. And that's what the idea of the double victory rallies. One here in St. Louis drew some 9,000 people. There were other ones in Chicago and in New York drew even more. Interesting enough, there was a case where the Southwestern Bell refused to hire more blacks. In the middle of World War II, out of 4,000 people working for Southwestern Bell, only 50 of them were African American. And there was a big push in order to hire more African Americans. And after all, the Southwestern Bell had 25,000 black customers here in St. Louis. And so when they were not able to get any attention out of the leadership of Southwestern Bell, what happened was they all got together and everybody paid their bill 1 month in pennies. That got their attention, and more African Americans were hired shortly after that. You have in 1949 a terrible incident that happens June 21st on Fairgrounds Park. What happened was that there are two public swimming pools in St. Louis. One at Fairgrounds Park and the other in South St. Louis. I forget which park it's in necessarily, but they were segregated. On that particular day, about a dozen black children went to Fairgrounds Park and wanted to go swimming. And what happened was there was a riot against them. Whites threw them out, and there was this terrible scuffle. The police came along, and the police then conducted the black kids away, basically for their own protection. But then the white mob that threw them out, rather than go back to swimming, they went throughout Fairgrounds Park and began finding other black picnickers and people enjoying the park, and they began beating them up. And then what happened was, word got around the neighborhood of what was happening, and dozens of black men came to Fairgrounds Park, and there's this huge melee between blacks and whites, a lot of fighting going on, when the police finally sent a large force in and separated the two. But this is something that becomes infinite in St. Louis history. Another action that's going to take place is in the Ville neighborhood. And again, shoppers go to the local A&P, which is owned by whites. Everyone working there is white, but they're black customers. And so some of the blacks began saying, why don't you hire some of our neighbors? Why don't people who are unemployed? And A&P basically ignored them. And so they got a campaign started, a boycott, and it's entitled, "Don't Shop Where You Can't Work." And what happens is that shortly after, about 10 days of that boycott, A&P then turned around, changed its policy, and began hiring black workers. And in fact set up a special program to teach butchery to blacks so they could become butchers. The same thing happens with Coca-Cola, with at least one milk delivery company, cabs. Stixbear and Fuller opened their lunch counters, integrating them as well as the American Theater. More action takes place. In 1944, St. Louis University integrated its student body. That was to the action of one particular Jesuit priest. That was Father Claude Heithaus. His nephew is a deacon in the Archdiocese today. But Father Heithaus had a daily mass at the college church. It was just a regular daily mass. He got up, and in his sermon, he preached against the segregation of the university and was widely applauded by the student body and some of the professors, and also he had some other support, and ultimately put pressure on the president of the college, who tried to resist the integration, but the provincial stepped in and integrated St. Louis University. 3 years later, Washington University is going to be integrated also. That's going to happen actually because, again, the double victory. There were a good number of veterans going to Washington University, and as a result of the VA programs, the GI loans, and these guys had fought to conquer the Nazis and the Japanese, and now they themselves they're white, but they realize the segregation taking place in St. Louis itself and at their own campus in Washington University, and they eventually were able to get Washington University to integrate too. The question came out to Webster College, what should be done, and the Loretta nuns couldn't decide one way or the other, so they led it up to a vote of the student body. These are all white girls, and they overwhelmingly voted to integrate Webster College then too. You also have, and I'm just going to stop on these two things here. Reverend John Hicks is elected to the school board, the public school board. He's the first African American to be elected. Others had been appointed, but then when the elections came up, they didn't succeed in retaining their position. He's actually elected to the school board and retains that position. Also, Theodore McNeil, African American, runs against Hogan. The Hogan machine in North St. Louis is very powerful. It goes back to the Prohibition era, the 1920s, and Jelly Roll Hogan finally is defeated, and he then, McNeil, becomes the first black Missouri state senator. It's during that same election that William Clay won a seat as an alderman. And voter registration among African Americans in St. Louis went almost overnight from 56,000 to 100,000. I leave you with one other thing, and then if you want to talk a little bit more about this, but a key date in racial relations in St. Louis took place on August 31st of 1963, and this is the sit-in that took place at Jefferson Bank. There were some 150 protesters that came in. Again, here's a situation in which there are a lot of black depositors in that bank, but they had almost no African Americans working in the bank itself. And so this is all about jobs, give us a chance to work. And so there was the 150 went into the lobby outside, they sat down, and they were all arrested, including Bill Clay. And then later on in November, they'll return again. And at this time then, eventually the bank began to hire black tellers. But the Jefferson City Bank, if you look at the whole history of race in St. Louis, Jefferson City Bank is extremely important because it got everybody's attention. So we're going to stop here as far as the presentation. Anyone want to give any observations or comments on any of